My son looked across a conference table at me and told 20 people that I was a retired nobody who didn't belong in his company. Then the door opened. His biggest client walked in, saw me, stopped dead in his tracks and said 4 words that made my son go completely pale. "Sir, what are you doing here?" My son thought he was about to impress the most important man in his career. He had no idea that man had come to see me, and before that meeting ended, Daniel was going to discover exactly what his retired nobody had built, and why the one relationship he thought belonged to him had never really belonged to him at all. Stay with me, because the insult at that table is only the beginning. The real betrayal happened years earlier, and when the truth finally comes out, you'll understand why the client shook my hand before he shook my son's. Welcome back to Vengeful Patriarch. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, older men being underestimated, and the moment arrogance finally meets consequences, subscribe to the channel now and stay with this one all the way through. Because today isn't simply a story about a father proving his son wrong. It's about the difference between having a title and having earned trust, and what happens when someone mistakes retirement for irrelevance. Every answer in this story opens another question. So don't leave when you think you know where this is going. The most important piece of the story is hidden inside a relationship my son believed he had inherited. My name is Richard Hale, and I was 69 when my son called me a retired nobody. For most of my adult life, I believed a father's job was to build something his children could eventually take further. I never wanted Daniel to spend his life living in my shadow. In fact, I spent years trying to make that shadow smaller. The company began in a rented office with 2 desks, 1 aging printer, and a telephone that seemed to ring only when someone wanted money. I called it Hale Systems. Daniel called it the old company. When Daniel was a boy, he sometimes came to the office after school. He would sit beside me while I worked. He knew the smell of the coffee, the sound of the copier, the names of the employees. I thought those memories meant something. They did, just not in the way I expected. By 41, Daniel had turned the company into a polished technology and logistics business with hundreds of employees. He was good at presentation. He understood modern sales. He knew how to walk into a room and make people believe he had already won. I was proud of him. Then, slowly, pride became distance. Daniel began saying things like, "Dad, that's how you used to do it?" At first it sounded harmless. Then it became, "That's not how serious companies operate anymore." Finally it became, "You need to let the younger generation handle this." I didn't fight him. At 65, I stepped away from daily operations. I kept a small office, some shares, and a few long-standing relationships, but I stopped attending executive meetings. Daniel called it retirement. I called it trust. For a while I thought we had made the right decision. Then one evening at a company anniversary dinner, someone asked Daniel how the business had started. He smiled and said, "It was a different world back then. My father had an old-school approach." Old school. 32 years of my life reduced to 2 words. I laughed along with everyone else. But I noticed something else. Daniel didn't mention the people who had stayed with us when the company was small. He didn't mention the clients who had taken a chance on us. He didn't mention the relationships that had kept the doors open during the years when one lost contract could have ended everything. And, most importantly, he didn't mention Thomas Avery. You need to remember that name, because Thomas wasn't just another client. He was the one client Daniel could not afford to lose, and 3 days after Daniel made another decision about my place in the company, Thomas called me. That call would turn my son's confidence into something much closer to fear. Thomas Avery had known me for more than 20 years. He ran Avery Meridian Group, a national logistics network whose operations depended on technology, data, and reliability. Our company had grown alongside his. When he called, his voice sounded almost amused. "Richard, are you free Thursday morning?" "Why?" I asked. "Richard," Daniel leaned forward, "Dad's contribution was a long time ago." I said nothing. Thomas replied, "A long time ago doesn't mean unimportant." Daniel looked at me. "We're here to discuss the future." I thought that was fair. Then Daniel made the mistake. He looked around the table and said, "My father retired. He can't keep showing up whenever he feels like he's still running things." I answered calmly, "I'm not running anything." Then why are you here? Because someone asked me to come. Daniel's face tightened. Then, with all those people watching, he said it. Dad, you're a retired nobody. This is a serious business meeting. Silence. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Thomas slowly leaned back. He looked at Daniel for several seconds. Then he said, Daniel, be very careful about what you say next. Daniel frowned. Why? Thomas looked at me, then back at him. Because you still don't understand why I'm here. And that was the moment Daniel realized the meeting wasn't about whether I belonged in the company. It was about whether he understood the relationship that had built the company in the first place. Thomas asked legal to bring out the original master agreement between Hale Systems and Avery Meridian. Daniel rolled his eyes. That's 20 years old. Thomas said, Exactly. The lawyer opened the file. I knew the document immediately. I had written parts of it myself. Daniel had seen the modern versions. He had never studied the original. Thomas tapped a paragraph. This continuity clause is why I wanted Richard here. Daniel looked at the page. The clause required a review if control of the company changed in a way that could affect the client relationship. Daniel looked at me. You put that in? Yes. Why? Because 20 years ago your company couldn't survive losing its largest client. Daniel smiled bitterly. You were protecting yourself. No, I was protecting the company. Thomas nodded. Your father understood something you haven't had to learn yet. A company can survive a bad quarter. It can survive a bad decision. What it can't always survive is losing the trust that took decades to build. Daniel looked irritated. We're not losing anyone. Thomas closed the folder. That depends. Daniel's expression changed. Thomas explained that Avery Meridian was considering a major expansion. The contract would be enormous, but it came with one condition, confidence in leadership. Daniel immediately said, You have my confidence. Thomas answered, I have your title. Then he looked at me. I'm trying to determine whether I still have confidence in the person holding it. That sentence landed harder than any insult. Daniel's face went pale. He finally understood that the client wasn't impressed by his position. The client was evaluating his judgment, and judgment was exactly what Daniel had been trying to prove he had by pushing me away. That evening, Daniel called me 6 times. I didn't answer. On the 7th call, I picked up. What did you tell Thomas? Nothing. Then why is he reconsidering the contract? Maybe he has his reasons. Daniel's voice rose. You planned this? No. You've been waiting for an opportunity to embarrass me, I answered quietly. Daniel, you embarrassed yourself. Silence. Then he said something I didn't expect. I'm scared. I sat down. Of what? Of losing everything I've built, I asked. Why would you think you'd lose it? Because everyone still compares me to you. There it was, the truth underneath all the arrogance. Daniel didn't hate me. He hated the feeling that he could never become enough in my shadow. I told him something I should have told him years earlier. You never needed to beat me. He didn't answer. You needed to become yourself. Then I added, but becoming yourself doesn't require pretending the person who came before you was worthless. He hung up. I thought the conversation was over. It wasn't. The next morning, an employee from the company called me privately. Richard, you need to know what Daniel is planning. And the next piece of the story was much more serious than a hurtful sentence. The employee was Harold, our former compliance director. He told me Daniel had approved an acquisition that could put enormous pressure on the company. I asked why. Because the financing assumes the Avery Meridian contract is signed. I went quiet. That meant Daniel wasn't simply trying to win a client. He needed the client. Harold sent me the projections. I studied them that afternoon. The numbers were aggressive. Not impossible, but dangerous. The acquisition would stretch cash flow. If the new contract was delayed, the company would have to absorb costs without the revenue Daniel expected. Then I found something worse, a risk assessment from the CFO. It had warned Daniel about exactly this problem. Daniel's response was only one sentence. Proceed. We cannot lose Avery. I stared at the screen. He had built a strategy around a contract he didn't yet have, and now I understood why my presence had become intolerable to him. I represented the one variable he couldn't control, my relationship with Thomas. But I wasn't going to use that relationship to punish my son. I want you at the contract review. I knew immediately what he meant. Daniel is running that meeting. I know. He doesn't expect me. Thomas laughed. That's why I invited you. I asked him a question I hadn't expected to ask. "Does Daniel know you're calling me?" There was a pause. "No. That one word told me something was wrong. I accepted. Thursday morning I put on a Navy suit and drove downtown. I wasn't going to confront Daniel. I wasn't going to reclaim my office. I wasn't even going to speak unless someone asked me a question. I simply wanted to know why Thomas still wanted me in a room my son had decided I no longer belonged in. When I arrived, the receptionist looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Hale, Mr. Daniel isn't expecting you." "I know. Should I call him?" "No, I'll wait." 10 minutes later, I heard Daniel's voice through the conference room door. "There's no reason to bring him into this. He's retired." Someone answered him, but I couldn't hear the words. Daniel laughed. "Trust me, he's not part of the company anymore." I sat there quietly. That sentence hurt more than I wanted it to. Not because he said I was retired, because he said it as if retirement had erased every contribution I had ever made. Then the door opened. Daniel saw me. For half a second, his confidence disappeared. Then he put it back on. Thomas stood. "We're putting the contract on hold until the board understands the acquisition risk," Daniel said. "You can't do that," Thomas replied. "I just did." And Daniel finally realized the person he had called a retired nobody had just become the most important voice in the room without asking for a title. That night, Daniel came to my house. He looked tired. Not angry, not arrogant, tired. He sat across from me and asked, "Are you trying to take the company back?" "No." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to stop confusing my absence with weakness." He looked at me. I told him that when I retired, I had transferred much of my ownership into a family trust designed to protect the company from short-term decisions. Daniel knew the trust existed. He didn't know I still retained voting rights over a portion of it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I wanted you to lead without wondering whether I was standing behind you." He looked down. "You were still watching. A father never completely stops watching." Then I showed him the original letter Thomas had written me years earlier. Daniel read it. The letter said Thomas would continue trusting the company as long as the people leading it remembered that relationships were earned, not inherited. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "I thought I had to erase you to become the CEO." I answered, "You only had to stop being afraid of me." For a moment it felt like we had finally reached the real conversation. Then my phone rang. "Thomas." His voice was serious. "Richard, we found something else." The next discovery would determine whether Daniel was merely reckless, or whether someone inside the company had been helping him hide the danger. Thomas sent me a report from the internal audit team. Several projections had been presented to the board without the full risk disclosures. I asked whether Daniel had approved the final version. "We don't know yet," Thomas said. That uncertainty was dangerous. If Daniel knew, he had a serious ethical problem. If he didn't know, he had a serious management problem. Either way, the company was exposed. I asked Thomas not to make a public accusation. "Why?" "Because I don't want to destroy my son. I want the truth." Thomas was quiet. Then he said, "That's why I always trusted you." The next morning, the board met. Daniel entered expecting to close the acquisition. Instead, he found me sitting at the table. The chairman opened the meeting. "Richard has been asked to advise the board regarding the proposed acquisition." Daniel stood. "He's retired." The chairman replied, "He's also a voting shareholder." Daniel looked at me. I said nothing. The CFO presented the risk analysis. Daniel tried to explain it away. "By Dad, what are you doing here? I was invited." "By whom?" Before I could answer, Thomas Avery stepped into the hallway. "By me." Daniel turned, and for the first time in years my son looked like a man who had just discovered that the room contained a person he couldn't control. There were 9 people in the room. Senior executives, finance, legal, operations, and Daniel's leadership team. Most of them knew me. A few had worked with me before Daniel became CEO. Daniel took the head chair. Thomas sat across from him. I sat near the end. Daniel started his presentation. For 20 minutes he was excellent. That's important. I don't want you to think Daniel was incompetent. He wasn't. He was ambitious, intelligent, and persuasive. His problem was that he had begun believing those qualities made him self-sufficient. He described a proposed expansion that would become the largest contract in the company's history. Thomas listened carefully. Then he asked one question. "Who negotiated the original relationship between our companies?" Daniel hesitated. That was before my time. Thomas nodded. Correct. Then he looked at me. Richard did. Daniel shifted in his chair. Thomas continued. And who personally guaranteed performance when Avery Meridian first trusted the company? Daniel didn't answer. Thomas did. I was going to use it to prevent him from destroying the company. That decision would force me into a room with Daniel's entire board. Thomas called another meeting. This time, the subject was the acquisition. Daniel arrived prepared. He had charts, forecasts, projections, and a confident speech. I watched him from the other side of the table. He looked like the executive he wanted everyone to believe he was. Thomas asked, How much of the financing depends on our contract? Daniel said, The business is diversified. The CFO corrected him. Approximately 60% of projected debt service depends on the expected revenue. Daniel glared at him. Thomas looked at Daniel. Did you know that? Daniel hesitated. I knew the numbers. Thomas asked me, Richard, what would you do? Daniel immediately objected. He's retired. Thomas replied, I asked him. I said, I would not close the acquisition until the company could survive without this contract. Daniel laughed. That's why you retired. You're too conservative. I answered, Maybe? Thomas asked, Why? I said, Because I remember what happens when a company confuses a good opportunity with a necessary one. Thomas nodded. Then he turned to Daniel. That's the answer I needed. Daniel's confidence cracked. He lost something else. The illusion that success made him independent of everyone who helped him get there. Before I finish, there's one detail I never told Daniel until much later. Thomas had not invited me to that first meeting simply because he respected me. He had received a warning. An internal advisor at Avery Meridian had told him that Daniel was making decisions that didn't match the culture of the company. Thomas wanted to know whether the man he trusted had changed, or whether the company had simply changed around him. He invited me because he wanted one honest conversation with the person who knew Daniel before the title. When Thomas saw Daniel insult me, he knew the answer. Daniel hadn't simply become ambitious. He had become ashamed of needing anyone, and that is what made the situation dangerous. Because people who are ashamed of needing others often make terrible decisions just to prove they don't. Daniel nearly did exactly that. The irony is that he didn't need me to save his company. He needed me to stop him from saving his ego at the expense of his company. And the client who shook my hand understood that before Daniel did. So what happened to the retired nobody? I stayed retired. I didn't take Daniel's office. I didn't take his title. I didn't demand an apology in front of the board. I didn't destroy his reputation. I simply stopped allowing him to confuse my silence with weakness. Thomas remained the company's largest client. The acquisition was redesigned. Daniel kept his position, but with stronger oversight. And most importantly, my son finally understood that a father's greatest victory isn't watching his child fail. It's watching his child become better after realizing he was wrong. If you've ever been treated as irrelevant because you got older, remember this: experience doesn't become worthless because someone stops asking for it. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who remembers how the room was built. And sometimes the person everyone thinks has lost his power is simply choosing not to use it. If this story meant something to you, tell me your opinion in the comments. Would you have forgiven Daniel after what he said, or would you have walked away and let him face the consequences, alone? And if you want another story about an older father being underestimated by his own family, only for the person who mocked him to discover that he had made one enormous mistake, watch the next Vengeful Patriarch story on screen. Now, thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And if you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe to Vengeful Patriarch. Your comment tells me what kind of stories you want next. I'll see you in the next one. Then the chairman asked him directly, Did you know these risks existed? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation was the answer. He admitted he knew some of them. He said he believed the Avery contract would solve the problem. The chairman asked, So you made a major acquisition dependent on a contract you had not secured? Daniel looked down. Yes. The vote was called. The acquisition was suspended. Daniel's face changed. He had spent years trying to prove he was independent. Now his own board had forced him to face the truth. But there was still one thing I hadn't told him. Thomas returned that afternoon. The conference room was full again. Daniel sat silently. Thomas walked in carrying a folder. Everyone expected bad news. Thomas looked at Daniel. "I have decided to proceed with the contract." Daniel looked up. Relief crossed his face. Then Thomas continued. "But not under the current structure." Daniel's relief disappeared. Thomas explained that Avery Meridian would proceed only if the board created an independent oversight committee and required the acquisition to be restructured. Daniel would remain involved, but he would no longer have unchecked authority over the transaction. Daniel looked at me. "You did this?" I answered, "No, your decisions did." Thomas then walked toward me. He extended his hand. "Richard, thank you." I shook it. Daniel watched. That was the moment from the beginning of this story, the moment his biggest client shook my hand. But Thomas didn't stop there. He turned to Daniel. "Your father didn't ask me for this contract." Daniel looked confused. Thomas continued, "He asked me to protect the company from a decision you were making because you were afraid." Daniel's eyes dropped. Thomas said, "You have a good company, Daniel. Stop trying to prove you built it alone." Then he looked at me. "You should be proud of him." I was. Even then, I told Daniel, "You don't have to become me." He looked at me. "But you do have to become worthy of the people who trusted you." Thomas extended his hand to Daniel next. Daniel took it. The contract was saved, the acquisition was restructured, and the company survived. But the story still wasn't finished. 3 months later, something unexpected happened. Daniel asked me to return to the headquarters. Not as CEO, not as chairman, not as a shadow executive. He asked me to speak to the leadership team about the company's history. I almost refused. Then I remembered the boy who used to sit beside me in the first office. I went. Daniel introduced me. "This is my father, Richard Hale. He started this company before I was old enough to understand what it meant." He paused. "And he taught me something I forgot." The room was silent. Daniel looked at me. "A company isn't built by one person. It's built by the people who trust you when you have nothing to offer them except your word." I looked at my son. He had finally said the thing I had hoped to hear for years. Not because he needed me, because he understood me. Later, when everyone had left, Daniel asked me one question. "Dad, are you disappointed in me?" I said, "I was disappointed in what you did." He nodded. "That's different." "Very different." He smiled. Then he asked, "Do you think I can fix this?" I said, "You already started, and that's the lesson I want you to remember. Revenge isn't always taking something away. Sometimes the most satisfying consequence is forcing someone to see the value of what they were willing to destroy." Daniel didn't lose his company.